Oh, Mickey, you're so fine, they killed and cloned you 16 times. Hey, Mickey. Hey, Mickey. Oh, Mickey, you're so fine, they killed and cloned you 16 times. Hey, Mickey. Hey, Mickey. You came out Thursday night, the previews did real well, but this ain't Parasite, it's a goofy sci-fi tale. I think that it's alright, for the rest I couldn't tell. Hey, Mickey! Wow, another song parody. I really didn't think I had it in me. I think I did a pretty good job on that one, other than the rhythm section. I have no rhythm. Obviously, it's a very casual night. I need a haircut, I need a beard trim. I'm in the lazy red sweater. I'm wearing my pajama pants right down off screen, but you know, I got a lot to lose and nothing to prove. So, or is that I have a lot to prove and nothing to lose? The hell with it. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And let's just say that after the last 2 grinding months as far as the faithless productions the major studios like to sandwich into the post-holiday weeks and the rare Indian foreign pickups that barely get any traction, man, this past Thursday was like a fire hydrant being opened in the faces of American cineasts, and honestly, that goes for whether or not you're looking for something on the more cerebral and artsy side of things, or you're just looking for a good time with some old-fashioned schlock, and even for the stuff somewhere in between that. Because we've got so much stuff at the very least peeking around the corner, I'm going to try to rattle them off as quick as possible, starting with the most high-profile festival darlings getting their very limited cosmopolitan theatrical runs, working our way down to more off-the-beaten-path art house, foreign, and indie stuff, then the stuff that's more Main Street accessible in terms of coming out in major multiplexes. Starting off with Ephus, a kind of absurdist sports drama, a debut as feature writer and director for previously mostly cinematographer Carson Lund. Unbecoming a Guinea Fowl, a sophomore effort for Zambian British writer-director Rungan Onyoni, following her 2017 debut I Am Not a Witch, that appears to be the top-line, most talked-about independent release of the week. Even more obscure, but still quite intriguing to see, you got You Burn Me, that being the latest experimental film by Argentinian filmmaker Matias Pinheiro. And then the French auteur Bruno Dumont is also entering the fray with his own genre-bending sci-fi fantasy comedy production, The Empire. Even some topical documentary options, including Housewife of the Year, this one coming out of Ireland, profiling former contestants of a real-life TV pageant and competition of the same name, Housewife of the Year, and sort of using it as a prism to examine sexism and generational shifts in modern Ireland. There's also the latest from Errol Morris, Chaos, that one obviously being an adaptation of sorts of Tom O'Neill's conspiracy book of the same name about the Manson murders and what O'Neill conjectures are its connections to the CIA's preceding and contemporary experiments with alleged mind control techniques. But you don't have to be in a major city to scratch the itch of something at least a little less mainstream, or at least a little more cerebral, coming to at least some Main Street multiplexes, because from there we've got a sophomore psychological horror film from New Zealand filmmaker James Ashcroft, that being The Rule of Jenny Penn, which already looks delectable just based on the twin star power behind it of John Lithgow and Jeffrey Rush. Italian actress Paola Cortese is probably getting the most surprising international reach as a first-time writer-director of a feature film with her debut, a post-war period comedy drama called There's Still Tomorrow. We've also got a sports biopic about the pioneering professional wrestler Mildred Burke, which, I'm gonna be completely honest, this is a thirsty pick. I'm still kind of ruined by last year's Love Lies Bleeding for gratuitous spectacles about really buff women, and it just seems like a nice opportunity to both educate myself about sports history, and particularly women in professional wrestling, and to ogle like the wolf in Red Hot Riding Hood without having to worry about, you know, a sudden stab of grotesquerie along the way. Just a nice, fabulous indie movie about nice, fabulous, independent women who could also kill me with their bare hands if they wanted to.
I kind of think that I'm cute and mink.
And if not for the movie I obviously saw for this week, probably the film I was the most interested in getting a limited release extending into select AMC and Regal theaters was Seven Veils, that being the latest production from Canadian-American auteur Adam Egoyan, and starring Amanda Seyfried. Always a pleasure to see her in a film. Tremendous actress. But, of course, the movie I obviously saw for this week was Mickey 17. This is the latest from South Korean megastar writer-director Bong Joon-ho, his much-anticipated follow-up to 2019's Parasite, which was both a major financial success for a foreign pickup as well as a critical and awards season juggernaut that saw easily the most positive reception of Bong's career, going all the way back to his official debut, that of course being the 2003 thriller Memories of Murder, which I think also easily ranks with among the absolute best movies of the 21st century so far, and honestly, absolutely well-suited for being ranked among the best movies of all time. Bong is, of course, going all the way back to Memories of Murder, an absolutely essential component to, at first, the explosion in cult fascination with South Korean cinema, though most especially what in the early aughts were seen as these ultra-violent, ultra-dour, though sometimes also quite stylish thriller films emerging out of South Korea in a kind of renaissance in their film industry. That film movement was where Bong, alongside key contemporaries such as Park Chan-wook and Kim Ji-woon, really forged what ended up being, over the course of the next 20 years, an actually much larger and mainstream accessible fascination with South Korean genre cinema, culminating, of course, in that major sweep for Parasite. Though it must be said, as a follow-up to Parasite, which is where the majority of film audiences would have been introduced to Bong's movies, something that has really laid the groundwork for a much higher anticipation for an internationally co-produced science fiction movie like Mickey 17 than you might otherwise see for a film of that type. For a non-franchise science fiction movie, as a follow-up to Parasite, it must be said Mickey 17 is definitely going to turn a lot of heads, polarize a lot of responses, because what anybody who is coming to a Bong Joon-ho joint with Parasite exclusively in the back of their mind is not gonna get is that there are really two distinct personalities to Bong Joon-ho's films. There is that Memories of Murder and Parasite Bong, that more cerebral, honestly consistently very much David Fincher-inspired taste of his films, where even when a certain air of pitch black comedy never leaves, it's still more or less a serious movie, for lack of a better way of putting it. Whereas over the course of his career, Bong has also developed an almost vacillating second kind of impression that he makes with the projects he chooses to pursue, this second personality that I will just call affectionately Cookie Bong. This is the Mr. Hyde side of Bong. This is the Bong who not only doesn't just like making sketchy, terrestrial, dramatic thrillers, but is just a full-on vulgar auteur and sci-fi and fantasy film nut who loves playing around in a high-concept sandbox where he can play a little looser with that line between a serious and a comedic tone, where he can get a little more absurd and decadent and theatrical, not only in terms of designing these productions, but also in casting and writing and directing them with an ear that far more embraces artifice and absurdity and an over-the-top emotional register. I'm thinking, of course, of movies like Snowpiercer and then Okja, and now finally, again, definitely a tip of the scale for anybody who's only reference for this guy was this highly regarded international art house dramatic thriller, this new film Mickey 17, an adaptation of the novel Mickey 7 by Edward Ashton. The thing about Cookie Bong is that as his international star has risen over the last 20 years, is that even with something like Parasite, even with interstitial films like The Host and Mother, and even Parasite to a certain extent, you're still getting at least a little Cookie Bong Bong, it's like how even on Eminem's more Marshall Mathers records, you still get a little Slim Shady mixed in there. Kooky Bong is not only here to stay, but as time goes on, just getting kookier, just letting that freak flag fly. And with Mickey 17, even after a definitive Kooky Bong movie like Okja, we're getting into new levels of Kooky Bong, for better or worse. Story of Mickey 17 set against a backdrop of pretty typical dystopian sci-fi fare. We're in the distant future, climate change has accelerated, income inequality has accelerated. There's a lot of people on Earth just looking to get out of Dodge and try their luck colonizing space, and a lot of nefarious, corrupt capitalist megalomaniacs looking to take advantage of that. Our protagonist is the titular Mickey, played by Robert Pattinson. He ends up getting deep into debt with a sadistic gangster, and without really reading through the fine print, decides to sign up to be a so-called expendable on a deep space colonial expedition led by our nefarious, corrupt capitalist megalomaniac character, Kenneth Marshall, played by Mark Ruffalo. And so what expendables are basically people who, on these deep space colonial missions, they're people who sign up to do all the most dangerous work, everything from exploration of hostile environments to repairs outside the ship to literally being guinea pigs for the scientists aboard the ship, except that expendables like Mickey then basically have their memories recorded onto a brick-like hard drive and then are cloned over and over and over again, hence the title, Mickey 17. We join Mickey on his 17th iteration as an expendable after Marshall's mission already reaches the hostile ice planet that they're seeking to colonize, only for him to be trapped in an ice cave. That is Mickey, not Kenneth Marshall's character. Mickey gets trapped in an ice cave-in and beset upon by a horde of hideous alien monsters dubbed creepers. Except whereas Mickey 17 is simply written off for dead, the creepers actually don't kill or devour him, but deliver him back to the surface of the planet, with the relatively dim-witted Mickey only being able to surmise that he must just not be a tasty enough meal for them. So Mickey makes his way back to the mothership, of course, discovers that his much more edgy and ruthless alter ego, Mickey 18, has already replaced him, and chaos and shenanigans ensue, all complemented by the sort of satirical framework for which Bong as a writer-director has become known and is especially pronounced in this movie and movies like Snowpiercer and Okja, his more transparently allegorical sci-fi fantasy flicks. Now, of course, the fact that many people are going to be getting their heads spun around by this kind of crash course in Kooky Bong after only being introduced to relatively cerebral Bong with Parasite, that of course does not mean that Mickey 17 should be judged unfairly in the light of that more serious film. This is Bong clearly working from the success of his previous film to do something a little more spontaneous, a little less rigidly dramatically structured, a little more extemporaneous in terms of where the story goes and how he chooses to explore this satirical, allegorical, post-apocalyptic world he's created. And there's plenty of stuff to like about Mickey 17 in its own right. While certainly not his best, in fact, I would say far from his best in recent memory, Pattinson manages to anchor the movie pretty well in his dual roles as Mickey 17 and Mickey 18. The performances across the board are generally good, with the standout not so much being Pattinson or Ruffalo in their more standout, over-the-top, on-the-nose satirical roles, but rather the supporting players, especially Naomi Ackie as Mickey's girl boss space cop girlfriend Nasha, and Holiday Granger in a much smaller role as a rival for Mickey's affections. The production design is good, Bong's direction of spectacle is generally relatively good. Look, I'm not doing a very good job of hiding the fact that I'm just being charitable, aren't I? Because the real thing holding back Mickey 17 doesn't really have anything to do with expectations, whether you're prepared to get full-on Kooky Bong after being wowed just a couple of years ago by Cerebral Bong. The issue is that even on its own Kooky Bong terms, Mickey 17 is a slog. And it's not just a slog because it's utterly redundant in terms of Bong's own sci-fi and fantasy films, as well as utterly redundant in terms of sci-fi and dystopian films of the last decade in general. On his own, Bong, even in his satirical, kooky bent, is not really working with any material that he didn't thoroughly explore, with much more creative novelty and much more excitement and drive with Snowpiercer and Okja. And when contrasted with the innumerable sci-fi and dystopian films that Mickey 17 either parallels with or even possibly references directly, whether we're talking about James Cameron's Avatar, quite frankly, the basic plot structure of Mickey 17 could be boiled down to basically a 2-hour distillation of both Avatar films, right? With, I hope I'm not spoiling too much, the creepers taking the place of the hyper-intelligent whales from Avatar. It's basically the same exact story. There's also, of course, Doug Liman's Edge of Tomorrow, aka Live, Die, Repeat, that it recalls. There's no getting around how similar the Groundhog Day premise of Mickey 17 is to that film. And I would even go as far to say that even in its satirical characterization of this dystopian future, in its portrayal of Kenneth Marshall as this fusion of defrocked politician and venture capitalist and cult leader, right down to the performance style and costume design and set dressing, there is absolutely nothing in Mickey 17 that comes off as any fresher or compelling than things we've already seen done to death in like young adult franchise fantasy films like The Hunger Games and The Maze Runner. For as astoundingly unoriginal as it is, again, both in terms of Bong's oeuvre as well as just recent sci-fi films in general, all Mickey 17 would really have going for it is, again, as a more deadpan black comic spin on those types of movies, almost like a black comic pastiche of recent sci-fi and dystopian films. And that's where we get into the criminal failing of Mickey 17, which is that as a black comic spin on these tropes, it is disastrously unfunny and dissatisfying. I would even go so far as to say that Mickey 17 sees Kooky Bong being at not only his most redundant, but his most smug and bemused with his own sense of humor, right down to the omnipresent use of Pattinson's narration that Bong basically uses to spell out so much of what is already abundantly obvious about the framing of every aspect of this story, from the basic Expendables cloning premise to the contours of this dystopian future to even the evolution of the relationship between Mickey and Nasha. It's almost as if how in the theatrical cut of Blade Runner, they took it away from Ridley Scott and they mandated that there be this narration that Harrison Ford is giving. It's almost as if someone did that but earnestly? Like Kooky Bong basically made his own theatrical cut of Blade Runner, warts and all. And as far as the relationship between Mickey and Nasha, which when it comes to the point where Mickey 17 is really just sort of chagrined to discover that Nasha is actually really excited to have two Mickeys to love, both representing basically polar extremes in what a modern independent woman claims they want out of a man but can never seem to find in one. Bong is so eager to be kooky that he just completely loses the plot on what could have been actually the most thrilling, the most daring and challenging place for this story to go, which is not to just ham-fistedly reiterate the same dystopian satirical tropes over and over again, but to actually play into the romantic and more especially the transgressive erotic potential of this story. But when compared to his contemporaries like Park Chan-wook and Kim Ji-woon, whether in cerebral or kooky mode, Bong has quite honestly always been decidedly toothless when it comes to portraying sex and playing up sexual tension in his films, which proves especially pronounced in Mickey 17, where what could end up being actually the most original and funny aspect of this reheated pastiche of dystopian sci-fi tropes ends up just being cast off to the side. Like, at least in Starship Troopers, we got to see all of those frickin' Buenos Aires hotties stuffed into a unisex shower and be so busy flirting they just accidentally let an asteroid destroy Argentina. At a certain point you have to ask, even within the broadly black comic framework of Mickey 17, what about this movie is even remotely as elementally funny or amusing as any number of schlocky science fiction and fantasy movies that also have a kind of freewheeling, extemporaneous decadence and absurdity. Obviously, I don't want to hold everybody up to Starship Troopers and obviously Total Recall, but you know, goat is goat. Nah, but really, is this movie nearly as funny as any number of films that just choose to play completely straight with it, choose to not condescend to the audience about constantly needing to have it reiterated to them like, ooh, hoo, hoo, isn't this wacky and weird? You know, instead to just take it for granted that that sort of decadence and absurdity is part of what we like about science fiction and fantasy, and that it's honestly a lot more humanizing and respectful to let your audience come to find their own knowing sense of humor in this sort of schlocky genre film and enjoy it on its own terms. I rattled off a lot of movies I was excited to see that came out this week, but I did ultimately neglect the rogues gallery of low-budget genre and exploitation films that also got some sort of limited theatrical or direct-to-VOD release this week. But as I was mostly just struggling to ignore the pretension and vapidity of Mickey 17, at least content to share the suffering with the Thursday night preview audience that was basically stone cold silent through all of Kooky Bong's strained attempts at black comedy, I couldn't help but feel like, man, I really made the wrong move by coming to see this instead of going to see the latest CGI slop fantasy epic by veteran schlockmeister Paul W.S. Anderson, which is, of course, in the Lost Lands. Paul W.S. Anderson may have never made a movie as critically regarded as Kooky Bong, and to not put too blunt a point of it, even though he himself has made some disastrously derivative and slogging films, I can't help but feeling I cheated myself by not just surrendering to the trustworthy whimsy of a tried and true exploitation filmmaker who just earnestly makes ridiculous, decadent genre movies and never condescends to his audience, always owns the ridiculousness and absurdity and lets that love of the ridiculous and absurd carry it. I mean, sure, there are some jokes in a Paul W.S. Anderson movie that go over like a Led Zeppelin, but at the end of the day, he has never made the mistake of assuming that he's funny, of assuming he can write dark comedies really well. And I gotta be honest, Snowpiercer had black comic elements, but it wasn't really a black comedy. Okja had some comedic elements, but was really more of a kind of earnest and whimsical movie in spite of all its violence, sort of like a mixture of Babe and My Neighbor Totoro, but with, like, again, Paul Verhoeven levels of violence and extreme absurdity. Mickey 17 honestly seems to be his first out-and-out sci-fi comedy, and it sucks. I'm giving Mickey 17 an exceptionally charitable 3 out of 5, certainly one of the biggest disappointments of this year so far. With that, I'm tapping out. Thank you so much for sticking through this review. Don't be a stranger to sounding off in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.